And welcome, friends. I apologize. Our technology is giving us some return to joy practice, more than we wanted this morning. But as I was saying, this is, many of you might be new here for the first, this might be your first joy stream. And what we're trying to do is engage pastors so that you can grow your joy. And the good news about relational joy is the more joy you have, the more you can share. And we're just going, each joy stream's unique. We have special guests. And we've got a good, really good joy stream in store for today, and we're trying to get you all interacting. And as I was saying, when our technology failed us for a moment, I just wanted to give a shout out to any Los Angeles Nazarene Association pastors. You might have heard, listened to Dr. Jim Wilder early in the week, and he introduced this opportunity to really help you grow joy and learn more about how joy applies to our lives and our ministries. So please raise your hand if you are part of that group that had the chance to hear Dr. Wilder. We'd love to know that you're with us. Otherwise, I want to welcome all of you. And we're just going to jump in here. I want to introduce Darrell Brazell, who's a pastor, a teacher, and author from New Hope Fellowship. And he's going to talk to us today about the zero factor, how shame prevents us from receiving joy. And Darrell, I just want to welcome you. Thank you for being here with us.
Well, thanks for having me today. Give me one second, see if I can get my screen up.
Let's see if your screen cooperates. I see. I can see you there.
All right. Well, I guess just a quick introduction would be good. I'm Darrell Brazell. I'm pastor of New Hope Fellowship and director of New Hope Recovery Ministries. And our kind of specialty area of ministry and work is in the area of pornography and sexual addictions. And this is out of my own journey of healing and recovery. And we've been running groups for men for a little over about 12 years now, and then working with couples and individuals and couples through that time in the recovery process. And where I wanted to start off today was with what I call the zero factor. And it's actually an analogy my 9-year-old son gave me last year, just on one of those days we were out for a drive. And my son's kind of his deal in school, kind of his area of glory is he is a math whiz. And so sometimes we're driving around, I'll just fire off math problems. You know, I'll say, okay, what's 12 times 13? Or what's 19 times 14? And get just a joy of watching him in the rearview mirror as you see the wheels of his brain turn and he cranks out answers. And so I was being kind of picking on him one day, and I said, okay, John, I got a really hard one for you. He said, okay, Dad, let me have it. I said, okay, John, what's 12 times 13 times 47 times 76 times 0 times 9? And I saw him in the rearview mirror kind of, you know, he kind of scrunches up a little bit, and he thinks about it for a few seconds, and he says, well, 0, of course. And so I said, well, how do you know that? And he said, well, because anytime there's a 0 in the equation, the ultimate answer is always 0. And as soon as the words came out of his mouth, I thought, perfect. Because what that described so perfectly was my own experience and the experience of countless of individuals that I work with who may experience tremendous success, accolades, rewards, etc. in all sorts of areas of their life, and yet they still end up feeling like a total 0. And for me, I was kind of the poster child of that of this concept. I was leader in high school. I was the leader of my youth group. I went to college studying Bible and doing a undergraduate and then a master's program in Bible. I made close to straight A's. I was, top of my class. I was hired for internships. I had everything surrounding me looked on the outside like I had it all together. But at the end of every day, I went home and believed that there was nothing there because I had an area of shame in my life that I had never exposed. I had never brought into the light with others. And that was my 0 factor. And unfortunately, That is a very common struggle for many, many people. And this is especially true for men in the area of secret sexual sins. And one reality that many times people, especially church people, are real resistant to face is that most men wrestle with secret sin. And what I mean by that is that there's been numerous surveys, research done of Christian men who attend church on a regular basis, and most of those surveys have come back showing at the bare minimum 50%, oftentimes as high as 75% of men who attending church regularly, actively involved, will admit to looking at pornography at least in the last week. And so one of the things that tells me is that this is one of those areas that is very well hidden. In fact, I would say that sexual sins are most often hidden in Christian communities. It's a place where we don't go there. We don't talk about that. It's one of those things that everyone sort of knows it's out there, but we're real resistant to talking about it. For example, I am on the planning committee for a large conference in Kansas City that deals directly with sexual addiction issues and pornography and these questions. And it's always amazing to me every year how much resistance we are met with in promoting the event. Churches don't want to promote it. They don't want to, it's amazing how many churches will just flat out tell us, no, we won't put any information out. Or it's also amazing how many churches kind of nod their head, okay, okay, and they take our materials, and then for whatever reason we find out later those materials were never placed in front of the people in the church. And one of the things that does is it just continues to compound the idea that sexual sin, even though it's so incredibly prominent, is one of those subjects that we cannot touch. We can't talk about, we can't deal with in the church. And that to me is a really sad state of our Christian communities. If our Christian communities are not the safe place to deal with these issues, then what are we doing? And one of the things that I've come to realize is that hiding destroys community and prevents the receiving of joy. And what I mean by that is it's always interesting as we know, as I observe new men who come to our groups. Invariably, when they first come to our group, I can't tell you how many of my guys have talked about how hard it was to come in the door the first time. And most guys, when they come in the room, they've got their head down, they're not making eye contact, because in the back of their mind, they have this sense of, well, I've got this big shame issue and I'm so much worse than everybody. There's just this weight of their sin and their shame weighing over them. And so one of the results that happens is that they don't make eye contact. They don't receive the joy that's being offered to them. And I would say this goes far beyond just our groups. I would also say it goes even into the other relationships, and especially the marriage relationship. A man who is wrestling with pornography and secret hidden sexual sin, his wife may love him and express joy to him and pour things out to, pour out and pour into him, but as long as he has the zero factor, then he's got a filter and a disqualifier that prevents him from receiving what she is giving to him or what anyone is giving to him. And so what happens is that whenever we are hiding, we end up cutting ourselves off from being able to receive the joy, receive the gifts that others are giving to us, because we have this zero in our equation that says, yes, but if they knew about this, then they would not be glad as glad can be to be with me.
Darrell, I hate to interrupt. We've tried to contact you via chat. We're seeing the presenter view, and a lot of people are commenting they'd rather see the slideshow view.
I am very sorry about that. Let me bump that and
That's
widen
better.
my chat.
Thank you. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so in as we're hiding, we don't receive the joy that other people are maybe even genuinely trying to offer to us. And the net result is that we end up, the real irony, the sad irony of it is that we end up even more stuck than we were before. Because one of the most isolation is always one of the most powerful, how would you put it? Isolation is the death nail of all addiction. That whenever you're in isolation, addiction just runs rampant and has even greater consequences. And when you are hiding, even if you're among people, then you feel incredibly isolated. And what's really compounding this today, is the fact that internet pornography is even more damaging than the pornography of the past. And what's interesting is even secular people are beginning to notice and acknowledge this. I just watched a video just yesterday, in fact, of someone this was in one of the psychology magazines, one of their websites. And what it was focusing on was the amount of erectile dysfunction that's taking place among 20-somethings men. And that they're trying Viagra, they're trying all sorts of different things, but there's a whole movement taking place among the 20-somethings of getting away from pornography because they're discovering that it's actually the constant use of pornography that's leading to ED issues. And where that, if we had, well, I'll go ahead and jump a little bit into it, but where that really boils down to is that the individuals begin conditioning their minds to needing a barrage of variety so that one person is not enough. And as a result of that, it rewires the brain in some very dysfunctional ways. And speaking of the brain, that kind of leads me to one of the slides I have in my Neurotheology of Sexual Addiction video that I was actually presented for the first time at Thrive, Track 4 several years ago. And that is a slide that compares the SPECT scans of sexual addiction with other SPECT scan imagery that those of you who are familiar with the Thrive materials have probably seen before. And the top left screen is a brain that was a sexual addiction and a ADHD brain. And then the slide directly under it is a brain of an individual whose primary struggle or issue, the reason they had the SPECT scan done in the first place, was an internet porn addiction. While the screens on the right side are your nicotine, caffeine, and your marijuana brains. And what I want you to see from that is you see the large holes in the prefrontal cortex especially. I mean, you can see the distortions everywhere, but you can especially see the large holes in the top of the slide is the front of the brain. And at the top front of the brain is our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that handles goal setting, being on time, learning from our mistakes, etc., etc. And you can see huge holes there because, well, just a quick side note on that, sexual addiction, pornography struggles, one of the questions is, does the ADHD cause that, or do the addiction cause the ADHD? Well, I think it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of question. It's a cycle, it's a circle. The more an individual is wrapped up in addiction, the more damage and more they shut off their prefrontal cortex. And then more their prefrontal cortex is shut off, then the greater their struggle with addictions, especially pornography and sexual addictions, ramps up even more. And so I know I'm running through a lot of material real quickly, but let's go ahead and go to the next slide and then we'll open it up. But one of the things, since this is a pastor's webinar, I thought it'd be good for us to just ask some questions about, what can pastors and churches do? And one of the first things that I think is real important is to create safe environments without a, quote, sin hierarchy. unfortunately, it's very common for anything in the sexual nature to be seen as almost the ultimate sin. That if people are struggling in this arena, then they're somehow much worse than anyone else. And I personally believe that there's not a sin hierarchy in Scripture, that sin is sin. In fact, if anything, if you think about it, Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love one another, love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. So if there is a greatest sin, I think that greatest sin would be the refusal to love, would be our failures to love. And so I think it's real important that we do whatever we can to create safe environments that do not have a sin hierarchy. But then second, I think we need to model transparency. And I know this is where it gets really scary, dicey for pastors. But the reality is, us as pastors, we are all strugglers as well. And no, it doesn't mean that you get up and stand up in your underwear every Sunday. But I think there is a very important place to be willing and able to talk about some of your struggles, talk about places where your sanctification is still in process. But then a third thing that I think is real critical is for us in churches to begin talking openly about the tsunami of sexual addiction. The reality is sexual addiction is everywhere around us. We have a pornographic paradigm all around us. My son is now 10 years old, and he's right at that age where he's starting to notice things. And he's also at that age where he's getting more and more interested in sports. And being in Lawrence, Kansas, this time of the year is a really big thing for us because March Madness is in full swing. And my son is getting more interested in watching basketball games and reading stories online and those sort of things. And yet it's amazing to me how hard it is to even find him any safe place on the web that he can go and read a story about KU basketball that doesn't have pictures of women that are barely dressed. And that is an unfortunate, difficult reality of our culture and our life today. And if we're not talking about it and dealing with it in the church context, then we are leaving our people very unprotected. But then a fourth thing that I think is absolutely critical, and this has kind of become one of my big soapboxes that I just want to preach at every opportunity I get, is that we must protect and empower the wives. I get phone calls, emails, I get bombarded every week by women all over the country, all over the world, who have been devastated by the discovery of their husband's pornography use or his use of prostitutes, etc., etc. And one of the saddest things to me is how oftentimes these women have experienced their own churches putting it back on them in subtle and not so subtle ways. I have personally heard elders say things like, well, if his wife was taking care of him at home, then he wouldn't struggle in this way. And what we have to recognize is that that isn't true. In fact, I can't tell you how many hundreds of men I've worked with one-on-one and in groups over the last 12 years. And every single one that I've worked with his struggle began long before he met his wife, let alone married his wife. And so with that, we have to do whatever we can to begin empowering women to know that this isn't something that they just have to live with and put up with, that this is something that they have an opportunity to address and to draw a line in the sand that says, you need to get help or you need to get out of my bedroom, because these are the damage this does to women's hearts and their lives is I can't even begin to express it in the little bit of time that I have here. But then finally, the last point that I want to make is that we need, as churches and pastors, to provide good resources for both men and women. And thankfully, especially for men, there are more and more good resources popping up all the time. And however, what's real critical to note is that sexual addiction, pornography addiction, love addiction, those things, it's not just a problem for men. It never has, but especially in today's internet age, it's becoming a greater and greater and more common problem for women as well. And so it's real important that we provide resources, that we provide a safe place, that people know that even if it's that they can see a pastor and they'll know they're not going to be shunned or shamed, but that they're going to have an opportunity to find resources and to find help and to find people who will walk beside them on this journey, even if they don't quite know what that looks like yet. So anyway, there's obviously many other things we could talk about, and I'd be very open to questions or thoughts, or I'll kind of hand it back to you, Chris, and we'll see where we go from here.
All right, thank you very much, Darrell. Wow, why do I suspect that we're just scratching the surface here? This is you've given us a lot to think about, and you said so many things I want to highlight here. But before I jump into some of that, I want to open up this opportunity for us to interact, all of us to interact a little bit. I've got some questions for us. Darrell, you started out by telling us that sometimes as pastors we have to hide our struggles, we have to hide what's going on, some of our addictions. We don't want to, we don't exactly feel comfortable sharing some of these things. And so what I want to pose here as for us to interact on is, what role does our fear play in keeping these struggles hidden? And I suspect, Darrell, there's good reasons for fears that men and women have as far as hiding their struggles. So let's talk about this. I'd love to hear from all of you here. What do you say fear plays in keeping these struggles hidden?
So remember, if you're ready to speak, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you, or you can type it in and say anonymous. If you don't want me to say your name, that's fine.
Well,
We'd
Chris,
love to hear your voices.
Yes.
Maybe I could tell a quick story in regards to that fear.
Okay, please.
1999, we moved from Roswell, New Mexico to Lawrence, Kansas, to a great extent because, well, I didn't realize at the time, but I was trying to run away from my own addiction in this arena. And so one of the first things I did was I put out a sign-up sheet for Men's Accountability Group, where I was going to tell the guys in the group that I struggle in this arena and I need their help in accountability. And one thing I did not, it had not crossed my mind is that when I put that sign-up sheet out, 2 of the 6 guys who signed up to be on it were the 2 elders who hired me and brought me to Lawrence in the first place.
Wow.
So you can guess what that did to my fear level when I realized that, wait a second, they hired me, they brought me here, they can fire me. So I said nothing about my struggle. And that really delayed my healing progress, I think, by probably about a year.
Wow. Wow. So what you're saying is isolation is kind of like playing in quicksand. It's not good for us. That's what
Sure.
I'm hearing.
I mean,
yeah.
once you...
Go ahead.
Well, just that pastors have to find safe people, whether it be other pastors or whether it be counselors, whether, other people in their community, to begin to open up about their own struggles. And then when it's appropriate, when they, it's like one of the things Jim Wilder talks about as far as in our own story with our kids. He talks about, one of the needs we have in our needs of growing up is to know our family stories. And one of the things Jim talks about in that for parents is, you want to tell your kids, your family stories that are redeemed. Mm-hmm. And so as pastors, as we can allow God to do the healing in our life and then be able to talk about those struggles from a redeemed perspective, then what it does is it provides people the hope that they can find solutions, but also it helps them understand this is a safe place, that we can talk about skeletons in our closet and they don't have to be hidden there.
Good. Well, Darrell, you just opened up my second question for our viewers right there. So I also want to open up the question of what would change if we developed the transparency that Darrell discussed. And so what I'm hearing, Darrell, is that by sharing some of our redemptive stories, we are creating safety for the people that we serve, the people in our life, as well as basically giving a context of what it looks like to share some of our struggles that we may want to basically hide.
So again, we're opening the phone line here. I'm getting questions that
What are your thoughts?
I'm getting questions that are not about your questions, and I'm just telling everybody I will read those later. We're trying to get these answered first, so just hang on the line if you're holding on that. But just go ahead and raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so we've got two questions on the table here. What role does fear play in keeping our struggles hidden? And again, we want to acknowledge these are real fears. They're there for good reasons for us in leadership, as well as what would change if we do develop that transparency that Darrell's talking about today? What are our thoughts here? Really like to hear from folks. And while I'm at it, I'm going to throw out a third question because they're all pretty much related here. And Darrell, I think you're really making a case for this one as well, is what steps can we take to stay proactive in this battle rather than reactive? And for those of us who are struggling with addictions and hidden addictions, it often feels like we are drowning. And so what can we do to keep a proactive approach in this battle rather than reactive? And Darrell, you're already, it sounds like, practicing this with your son, right? You're helping him to stay proactive as he starts asking questions and he's exposed to different sites and sites on commercials and images and so forth.
Okay. Hi, I'm getting a couple of things. Someone said, I believe the fear of rejection keeps us in isolation and keeps us in shame, that transparency would bring hope and a safe place for those who struggle.
Yes.
Someone else said, hiddenness develops from someone who hasn't found a spiritual family, elders who can be a non-anxious presence. And Leonard's got his hand up. Leonard, are you there?
Leonard, welcome.
Hi. Hello, how are you?
Good.
A couple of things. One of them, Darrell, if this is an excellent topic here. One of them is, the question I have is, what is the idea of fear, as Jim Wilder talks about, as people are wrestling with double binds, or how nothing good can come out of this, and how we are to address our fears head on, trusting that God is bigger than that and can bring something redemptive out of it. And also this idea of how our flesh plays in this versus how the demonic plays in this area of keeping down our transparency or our willingness to open this up. Can you address those a little bit?
Yeah, I'll try. Those are both really big questions, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Fear is always, fear, I'm thoroughly convinced that fear is one of, if not the favorite club of the enemy. And so he uses fear in every aspect of this struggle. A man who's married, and Satan uses fear to drive a man back to his addiction. He's fearful that, for example, in my own story, I realized in the first week of my marriage that I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. And when I make that statement, especially with audiences, I always kind of see some shocked look on people's face and their eyes and stuff. But that statement isn't about anything to do with my wife. It's about the reality that I realized about a week into my marriage that I had now given, by marrying her, I'd given the person whose opinion of me mattered to me more than anyone else, 24/7 access to me. And so I realized in great terror that it was only a matter of time till she saw what a fraud I believed I was, hence the zero factor again. So in great fear, guess where I turned? Back into addiction. And then in regards to, for example, like my desire to get it out in the light, my desire to get more accountability. Well, guess what kept me from telling any of the men in my life who could have helped and walked with me? It was my great fear of what would happen if they found out I struggled in this arena. And then as far as the demonic goes, and I am certainly not, that's not my field of expertise at all, but I will tell you that working with men and families trying to heal from this, if you do not believe in the enemy's power to work and arrange circumstances and pull power plays, then if you didn't believe it before you started it, you would develop a belief in it very quickly. Because the number of impossible situations that have come up when guys are at critical points in their recovery, or couples are, and the outlandish, crazy stories that I could tell you if we had time that are stranger than fiction can only be orchestrated that well if we have an enemy who is very actively involved in trying to steal and kill and destroy. And that's especially true in our relationships.
Mm-hmm. That's sobering. So it's a fierce battle on many fronts. Okay. Thank you, Leonard.
Chris, if I could go back to your question on proactive, and somebody mentioned,
yes.
I think you were mentioning my son, and I think that is a critical place that the church needs to step in.
Mm.
In my generation and, until the last 10, 20 years especially, if you were going to be involved with pornography, you had to get a magazine, you had to take the risk of being, go to a store, all those things. Our kids today are growing up with instant access all around them. Mm. They don't just have their home computers, they have iPods, they have iPhones, and if they don't have them, their friends do. Mm. And I can't imagine the kind of mess that I would have been in if I would have had that kind of access from my earliest days. So if you have children and you're not talking to them about why it's so important to protect their eyes and to deal with these kinds of imagery, by the time they're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, you're already way behind the curve. Hmm. And it doesn't mean you don't go ahead and talk about it now, but it just means, especially for those with younger children, it's time to talk about it. And it's critical to have, filters and accountability software, but that's not enough. What's most important is for there to be open lines of communication, so that not if they get exposed, but when they get exposed, there's the opportunity to talk through it and work it out.
And that's key. And with the stats that you've given us today, Darrell, I also think of our pastors here who have congregations with men and women who are sitting there struggling with this stuff. So you're really talking about some important things that as pastors we need to do to create that safety within our communities and our families, as well as proactively start raising our joy levels. So
I think that is a perfect segue to this next person's comment/question. They're saying that when they come from a church background that puts the responsibility on the way a woman dresses rather than on the man controlling his passions. He said what was taught verbally and by example was that a woman was to dress modestly, loose dresses, long skirts, blah, 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 and to not be forward in any way, that this was how to prevent a man from struggling sexually. So is that what elders should be teaching, or what are your thoughts about this, Darrell and Chris?
all right. Well, Darrell, what do you want to say about that one?
Well, I greatly appreciate that question because it opens some really critical doors. First and foremost, it is always a man's responsibility to deal with his own eyes. And so with that, the reality of that is that even if a faith community, even if every woman in the church dresses like they're in Siberia every Sunday, that will not solve the problem for men. Because the reality is, one of the things I say often in my teachings is that God created Eve beautiful and he hardwired Adam to notice. And that's not where the problem comes. The problem comes when it goes beyond noticing to devouring. And unfortunately, in our culture and our world, there is a smorgasbord of scantily clad or no clothing at all women available for men all the time on the internet, on billboards, in their culture community. And so in church communities, even if and when the women have great modesty, unfortunately a man who has spent countless hours feasting on the images of women, he's going to impose those images over even the most modestly dressed attire. Now, with that said, then I will come back full circle and tell you that I can't tell you how many times I've had men talk about in group or counseling sessions how much they were struggling in their church because of how women were dressing inside their church. And just as a side note on that, recently I've been preaching through Ephesians, and I took a side trip out and did a series on maturity, stealing a ton of stuff from Jim Wilder on the maturity stages, needs and tasks. And I spent most of a whole sermon talking real honestly to women about how their dress impacts us as men. And I spoke on it from a very vulnerable place. In fact, I'll tell you, it's the riskiest sermon I think I've ever preached. Because I just laid it on the line. And it's on my website if you click on the Sermons tab, and it's the Growing Up series. And there's a note in there that's specifically on this message.
Good. All right. So what you're saying here as we move into our next questions is we can't stop birds from flying over our heads, but we can prevent them from building a nest in our hair, as someone once said. So we need to stay proactive and even inviting the women to help us in this process of just really working on purity. Okay.
Yeah, I think a good way of wrapping that up, as a thought comes back through my head, Chris, is that, ladies, you do men a great service when you dress modestly. But
go ahead.
So it is an act of service for them, but it isn't your responsibility to prevent them from lusting.
That's well said. So that really answers part of how we can help each other. So creating that kind of an environment that's safe, as well as what we would call a protective environment for everyone, can go a long way. Okay, and I know, Denny, you had some questions.
Yeah.
You can take a few minutes for those.
And first of all, as a woman, I have to comment back to that to thank you for that, because as a woman, sometimes we feel shame just because we look good. There's a line there, so it's nice to know that we can, in an act of service, be modest, but if someone looks our way, we shouldn't feel shamed. So
Sure.
I
And I
appreciate
think that's a real important balance. God
Mhm.
created Eve beautiful,
hmm
and He created Adam to notice and appreciate her beauty.
Mm.
But the problem is when it goes beyond, it goes to a place of devouring rather than giving thanks for it.
Mm. Well said.
All right. I have a comment from Hoka saying, because we have seen the consequences for the people who have shared their struggles, there's no grace for them. They're only isolated. She says that the church doesn't know how to restore or help them. They just seem to send them away.
Mm.
And someone else that has actually already left had said they need to develop a leadership team of elders tasked with being that non-anxious presence by continuing to get healed themselves.
Good. Yeah, that's kind of what we've described in previous Joy Streams about the weak in the communities and the strong in communities being able to not only interact together, but respond with tenderness to the weaknesses that are there for both the strong and the weak. And so I really appreciate this message that Darrell's giving us today, not only giving us a language, but shining the light on something that seems to remain hidden most of the time. All right, we have time. We have about 2 more minutes for questions. So anyone else have some questions you'd like to ask Darrell?
Here's a question from someone in Kansas City wanting to know where the seminar is that Darrell mentioned earlier, where and when. If he could maybe post a link to that. You can put it in the chat window to everybody, Darrell, if you know of it. And other people are asking about resources. So I don't know if
Yes, which we'll get to resources actually in just a few moments. So I'm glad those thoughts are coming up for people. Okay. Any other questions before we move on here? Give everyone the opportunity. Well, I'll just say one final thing here. I thought was interesting, Darrell, you showed those SPECT scans where that prefrontal cortex was really dimmed and offline in some of the addicted brains. And I also found that interesting in terms of impulse control. Could we say that that's going to impact how well people can control their impulses when that part of the brain is not fully functioning?
Yeah, absolutely. The prefrontal cortex is, like, for example, one of the chapters in my recovery manual is called A Fellowship of the Forgiven. And one of the observations we made years ago, fairly early in our ministry, was that noticing the difference in men who came to us and did really well and the ones who came and struggled. And one of the things we noticed is that some of the ones who struggled most were ones that from an outside perspective you would think would do best. They were guys who devoured materials, they were very smart, articulate, etc., and so they would read all the information, but what was missing was they weren't building relationships, they weren't making connections with each other. And then we had several guys who weren't very good at materials, and they weren't real books, you know, they weren't great students in school. But the thing they did well was they engaged the community. They came to multiple groups, they made phone calls, and they began sharing and receiving joy. And what we noticed is those guys very quickly started finding traction in sobriety.
Wow. That's pretty important right there.
I'm sorry, I had to cough, had to mute and cough. I got quite cold.
That's all right.
But what happened with that is that we began to realize that then we discovered the Thrive material and the stuff on the brain and realized that this is why. Because as they were sharing and receiving joy, they were growing their prefrontal cortexes. And then they were more able to say no to cravings and resist their urges.
Wow, so what a vivid reminder of the importance of joyful relationships. All right, I've got to move us along.
Sorry. One person had their hand up there trying to get her to see if she'll talk. Teresa?
All right. Teresa. I'm not sure if Teresa's coming through there.
I've got you unmuted, Teresa. Okay. I guess you can go on.
Well,
maybe it was an accident.
Let's move on. Darrell, I got to acknowledge, I know we're just scratching the surface here. We're going to have you back on to talk some more about this stuff. And one of the things I want to mention to all of our viewers is we're really, especially after our today's technological glitch, it's a vivid reminder. We are pursuing new software. I just want to keep this on the radar because our goal is to dialogue. And as much as I love to talk, and there's no shortage of things I could talk about, that's really not going to add joy to your life. What's going to help us all is to interact with each other. And so I want us to have the kind of forum here that we can interact, so that next time Darrell comes on, we could see Darrell more. We could see his, obviously still be able to see his presentations. So just keeping that on the radar. We are working on it. We'll give you the heads up. If you're on our email newsletter, which I'm suspecting most of you are, you'll hear more about that. In the meantime, Denny and I really want to ask you a question here as far as how many of you have a microphone and a headset for these joy streams. And so, Denny, how can they give a response for this question? There we go. I'm seeing a slide coming up there.
Sorry, I was on mute.
So,
go ahead and select
okay.
one answer.
Oh.
What do you have on your computer?
Do you have a microphone and headset?
About half people have voted, so let's give them
Okay.
a couple
All
more
right.
seconds.
Well, inquiring minds want to know.
Right now it looks like 30% or so have a headset, 40 have speakers and a microphone,
Okay.
25% speakers only.
All right. That's helpful for us as we're trying to gear these joy streams to effectively meet our needs here.
I'm going to go ahead and close it so you can do the next one.
All right. So, next question. How many of you have a webcam? If we were to go with the software where we can actually see each other, how many of you have a webcam that you'd be able to engage that route?
That's simple, yes or no?
Yes or no? Denny has us set up there. Very good. So we'll take a moment for you to answer that question. We
Someone just chatted it would be scary. I guess he doesn't want to be.
All right. Yeah, and that's some people might not want their face on this. We understand that. We want to be able to be sensitive to those things.
Yeah. All right. About 70% seem to have that, so I'll go ahead and close it.
Okay. Very good. Okay, and then the last question here, which we're going to answer at the very end when you log out. So don't worry about answering this right now. Some of you prefer typing questions rather than talking. So from our point of view, what can we do to help you engage? Is there anything we can do to help you engage more? So any suggestions, we are really wanting to hear from you because our goal is really to support you, refresh you, and grow some joy together through this kind of a online environment.
Now,
so
because of our technical glitch earlier, you may have already gotten that question pop up when we accidentally ended. So if you deleted out of it and didn't answer it, if you want to email me at materials@lifemodel.org, just let me know why or why you don't want to speak. That would be helpful.
Yes.
Go on.
And our last few points here to make would be upcoming joy streams. You can join Jen and I in 2 weeks, April 4th, on how to pastor my family, and that means serving your congregants without neglecting your marriage and children. Jen and I are going to talk about that. Then we have Ed Corey talking about beeps and leadership, which I suspect will be very complementary to what Darrell has introduced today. And that's on April 11th and April 18th. And then last, April 25th, we're going to have David Tackle back. And I am going to talk with you, Darrell, some more about getting you back on the calendar because I suspect our viewers are going to want to hear more from you. And you also have some really good resources I want to recommend. You have a 2-part session DVD called Protecting Eve, which you mentioned today. It sounds like a really good resource, as well as the Neurotheology of Sex and Addiction DVD. You've got New Hope for Sexual Integrity Recovery Manual as well as an ebook. So I invite our viewers to check out these resources at newhope4si.com. So please visit this website. And we have Carol Brown and I have a new Joy Starter blog for pastors. So visit our blog at joystarters.com and see what we have to say about growing your joy levels. And we have training coming up. April 5th and 6th is a Thrive Rekindled Marriage Retreat, Grow Your Couple Joy, as well as we have some Thrive training, which is what Darrell's mentioned about actually training people in some of these relational brain skills. So we have various events. You can learn more on our website at thrivetoday.org. And we have a brand new announcement October 3rd through 5th. We're having a Joy Starts Here conference in Morton, Illinois, which will be when we're going to release our brand new book called Joy Starts Here. However, we will have a beta version released sometime next month. I'll keep you posted on that front. There's great resources. I'm just running out of time to mention all of them. thrivingrecovery.org as well as lifemodel.org. You'll learn more about all these wonderful resources. But I'm reached my limit. So I just want to thank you, Darrell, for being here. Thank you for shining the light on this topic that is desperately, desperately needed.
And thanks for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Well, we got to have you back. We got to have you back. And I want to thank Denny. Denny, you're doing all this behind-the-scenes work that lets me focus on the Joy Stream, so thank you for your work. And just want to say a blessing to all of our viewers. Thank you for being with us. I hope you'll join us in a couple weeks. We've got more Joy Streams on the horizon. Visit thrivetoday.org and find out what those are. Or email me if you have some questions or if you're interested in more about the training. God bless you all. Have a joy-filled day, and thank you for being with us today.